Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Today I have a very special guest who will provide us with a very valuable European perspective on the world affairs. I have on the show Arnaud Bertrand, who is a prolific writer on Twitter and I believe also now Substack, yes? Um, and so who write
Exactly.
extensively on China related issues. And, I think, Arno, you will probably do better justice introducing yourself to my audience. So why don't you give yourself a brief introduction?
Sure. So I'm actually an entrepreneur originally. I'm still today. So I studied business in Switzerland in a city called Lausanne, and then I created a company called House Trip, which I led during 7 years in Europe. We were based in London. And then we sold the company to TripAdvisor in 2015. And that's when we decided with my wife, to move to China. Because my wife is Chinese, and we wanted to have kids. And basically, our logic was that to educate mixed kids, French Chinese kids, it was better to do it in China because we wanted them to be educated in both cultures. There are French schools in China, whereas there are no Chinese schools in France. So strangely, it was easier to educate them in both cultures in China than it was in France. And so we lived in China during 8 years. Now we're based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, for the past 2 years. But we go back to China several times a year. And we've created another company called Mi and Chi, which is in the traditional Chinese medicine space. But as you pointed out, now I also spend a lot of my time writing, because I've become, living in China, I've become very interested in the country, and just of pure as a hobby, basically, I've started writing quite a bit about it.
Yeah, I really appreciate your posts. As I was telling you earlier, you actually take your time to write these very long posts on Twitter. And on Twitter I don't bother read people's long posts because I just don't have time for that. But your post is very well written, very articulate, and it's on a subject that's to me of great interest, which is on China and also China's relationship with the rest of the world. One reason I invite you to my show today is actually I wanted to discuss with you the role of Europe in the time of U.S.-China competition, because many people had hoped EU could be another pole in the multipolar world, but for
Mhm.
whatever reason,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
hasn't happened yet. And so far it looks like EU leaders has been pretty much um, very happy to play the puppy dogs to Washington. I mean, as we saw with the current Nexperia case, when Dutch government sees a 100% owned Chinese company. So you've written extensively about this, but for for the case for my audience, I just like to ask you, why do you think that is? Because there was a time when Europe did have uh, different countries in Europe did try to chart independent path, particularly in France's case. During the time of Charles de Gaulle, he actually you know pull France out of NATO, and also try to have a better relationship with the PRC, People's Republic of China. And even as late as the Iraq War, I remember there was French and German resistance to the unilateral U.S. action on invasion of Iraq. But what happened? What happened? Can you just share with us some of your thoughts?
Sure. I think a big part of it is weakness and strategic dependency on the US, basically. So you refer rightly to the time of the Iraq War, which is a time when Chirac was president of France. At the time, France was still not in NATO because De Gaulle, as you said, had pulled France out of NATO. They were still not back in NATO back then. But then, since then, Sarkozy, who is the next president after Chirac, puts France back in NATO. And when you're part of NATO, basically it's kind of like a protection racket, right? When you have another country that is in charge of your protection, which is what being part of NATO means, because it's basically it's a US-led military alliance where the US provides all the weapons, and in fact you need to sign up when you're part of NATO to for I don't remember the exact term, interoperability or something like that, meaning you need to adapt your entire military to US standards. So in many ways, it means it puts shackles on you, strategic shackles. That means that you're defended by the US in a US military system. And when you're defended by someone, there is not much you can do against them, right? So that's why I think that's a big part of the reason why we've seen sort of this rhetoric die down. It doesn't die down completely. So, for instance, at some point, Macron said that Europe needed strategic autonomy. And he tried to push for that, but Macron speaks a lot, but does quite little, unfortunately. So that hasn't. Well, Europe and France is even haven't moved in that direction at all. And in fact, despite everything, even despite Trump, I think many people in Europe today they realize Europe's predicament, how bad our strategic position is, but they can't do otherwise than making it even worse. So, for instance, you had this episode during the summer with the tariffs. On this negotiation between the US and on Europe around that, and Europe basically surrendered. So they signed up for a tributary deal. It can be called like that, where they agree to send a lot of money to the US, buy an enormous amount of US energy, buy an enormous amount of US weapons, a lot of things that will make them even more dependent to the US. And I posted about interviews with top European leaders where they understand that it is a tributary deal, but they say, not doing it would have been even worse, because we would have faced, extremely strong retaliation by the US, very strong pressure that, would have been very bad for us. So, you can argue that it's a lack of courage, and it certainly is. It's a lot of principles. It certainly is, but that's the dynamic. Basically, they're kind of in their mind, they're kind of stuck, and there is no political courage to basically take the US on. That's what it is.
Well, I understand inertia and a lot of the bureaucratic pulls from Atlanticist organization like NATO. But what I always find puzzling is why the persistent hostility among the European elite toward China. Like China has, they keep on portraying China as some sort of security threat to Europe, which is preposterous because China is on the opposite end of Eurasian continent. and the most interaction China has with Europe is through trade, but yet, right now there's a tendency to talk China through a security lens, and which, I mean, I'm guessing there's a lot of Washington pressure behind that. But why did European leaders go along with it? I do not understand, because China is actually one of the biggest trading partner for EU at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. So I've been saying this all along. I think it's a very bad strategic call, and I think that Europe, that's one of the ways in which it has actually leverage. It could tell the US that China is an alternative. It could play that sort of pivot role where it says, if you don't give us good terms, then we're going to go to China and sort of play one against the other. That would be a good, a sensible strategic positioning for Europe. In fact, some European leaders at some point, said stuff along those lines. Even surprisingly, that there is this organization called IPAC, which is the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. And I was very surprised at some point this year, you had one of the leaders of IPAC in Europe say exactly that, Europe will go to China as an alternative to the US. It will be, they will play this pivot role when IPAC is one of the key anti-China organizations. So that was very surprising, right? So it's clear that some of those think along those lines, but others don't. It seems that the lines of the others have won. And I think their thinking, and you can surmise that from some stuff that Macron has said. At some point, Macron said that he doesn't understand Trump, that for the US the first objective should be China, and Europe should be an ally for them in that regard. So I think that's the positioning that won in Europe, trying to impress upon Trump that Europe is not an enemy; it's an ally against China, and trying to basically keep the traditional positioning of we're on your side, we're your best friends. You need to give us the best conditions because we can help you in a number of ways, which I think is the wrong call, because knowing Trump, what he sees is weakness, and when Trump feels weakness, according to his own declaration, he has no respect for that, and that's when he presses for the worst conditions, on which is exactly what we're seeing in all the deals that he's making with Europe. Again, on the proposal that they made with regard to Ukraine. It's extraordinary how bad that is for Europe. It's a great deal for the one that the US proposed is great for the US. It's actually pretty good for Russia too, because they win the territory. There is denazification in Ukraine, no NATO expansion, so it meets a lot of their initial requirements. But for Europe, it's horrible. They need to bear all the costs. And all the benefits go to the US, right? So Europe has $300 billion of Russian assets which are frozen. Out of those 300 billion, 200 billion will go to joint US-Russia investments, and 100 billion will be used for Ukraine, but 50% of that will go to the US. So like nothing for Europe. So yeah, that's why I think this strategy is will end up being extremely bad for Europe. But uh, we can only witness that that's the one they've chosen, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm really surprised how badly Europe plays this game. I mean, in a way, they play it worse than the Gulf Arab states. You have countries like Saudi Arabia who, as you said, exactly plays the China card. They announced they're thinking about pricing the oil sale to China in RMB, and they're joining BRICS. And suddenly Trump is courting them. Trump traveled to the Gulf countries, and then Trump invite MBS to the White House, right? And whereas Europe, the whole optics is just bad. You have all these European leaders sitting like school children in the White House, waiting to be scouted by Trump, and von der Leyen sitting there very demurely while Trump is announcing Europe is going to pay. We're going to make Europe pay, and she's positioned that as some sort of diplomatic victory because Europe only got slapped with 20% tariff instead of 50% tariff. So that somehow that's a great deal. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just flabbergasted.
Yeah, I think the Nexperia case is actually extremely illustrative because it shows that when Europe could have positioned it in a way where they benefit from both sides, so the US and China, as per their positioning, they basically get hit by both sides, which is exactly what the Nexperia case is, right? So I don't know, maybe I can explain it a bit. Yeah, so what happened is the US basically introduced a new rule called the BIS 50% rule, which says that any company owned by a company sanctioned by the US would itself be sanctioned, which was not the case before. And so, for instance, so in this case, there is the Chinese company called Wingtech, which has been sanctioned by the US since December last year. And they own that company in Europe called Nexperia, which is a massive company. It's 14,000 employees, most of them in Europe. Very important for Europe's industry because they provide the chips for the European auto industry, and also, by the way, a lot of the American auto industry, and other industries as well. So it's a very strategically important company. And so that new rule would have meant that Nexperia would have been on the US entity list, which means, which is very bad for them because they can't use the dollar, they can't do any business with US persons, and so on and so forth. But the Americans went to the Dutch, because the company is based in Holland, and they told them, we have a very easy solution for you. You just need to steer the company away from the Chinese, and that will make you, a Dutch company, and therefore you will not be sanctioned. And the Dutch, stupidly chose to comply, and so they invoked this World War II era law, which had not been used since 1952, a law that basically allows you to requisition, strategic supplies during wartime. And they basically said Nexperia is strategic supplies, and we requisition it. What they hadn't thought about is that 80% of Nexperia's chips are made in China. And so obviously what is the first thing that China did is, okay, I mean, you steal the company from us, so, say goodbye to the chips, right? And, obviously that had tremendous consequences on the European auto industry. And then during the meeting that Xi and Trump had in Busan in South Korea, Trump agreed to withdraw that BIS 50% rule in exchange for China withdrawing their rare earth export controls. Which means that the Dutch were basically left holding the bag, right? Like they had stolen a company away from China for no reason anymore, because that rule that's that had spurred this move was removed by the US. So again, this is Europe bearing, all the costs. Both on the US side and the Chinese side, being basically in the middle of both of those for, entirely due to their positioning. So what I said right from the start is Europe could have positioned itself as a principled actor, saying, this is a US extraterritorial law. We don't need to apply it. We actually, have our own law. European companies based in Europe need to respect European law. They don't need to respect American law. Nexperia did, so we're going to protect it. And that would have granted it, that would have made Europe much more attractive to companies from everywhere, because now everyone feels okay, like we're protected in Europe from American extraterritorial legislation. Those guys, have their own rule of law and so on. It's they're strong enough to protect us, and it would also have given them leverage, like a leverage point against the US as well. So that would have been, a very good thing, a good opportunity for Europe to assert some form of strategic autonomy. But instead, they bowed down to the Americans, which made them, which triggered this retaliation from China. So they could have had a win-win, but they went for lose-lose, which is basically what Europe has done for the past 10, 15 years. It's just it's very depressing.
And afterwards, there was a recent interview with a Dutch minister who authorized the seizure of Nexperia. He said, well, given what we know, now Dutch government is trying to hand over Nexperia back to China. But he said, in the interview, he said, given what we know, I would do it again. I would do it again. Like, why would you even make statement like that? That I don't want. Is he trying to speak to a particular audience, trying to show his loyalty to the United States? I don't understand. Like, why? It's just completely unnecessary. It seems to antagonize China in that way. When there's already a chance for closure, now the Dutch is preparing to hand over Nexperia and just put this matter behind us. Why would he even give an interview, say, oh, given what we know, I would do it again? I mean, it's just is that hubris? Is it arrogance? What is it?
I think it's a mix of ego and just stupidity, and they don't understand what their words apply, what their words, the consequences of their words, and we keep seeing that all the time from European leaders. So, just recently you had Merz, so to the German chancellor, trigger a scandal in Brazil because he said that he was very happy to leave Brazil and go back to Germany because the place where he was in Brazil sucked. Which, I mean, you just don't say those type of course, that's going to annoy Brazil. And of course, that's shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because why would you do that? It makes no sense. So it's just, they're not thinking about what they're saying and the consequences for Europe's diplomatic position.
Now, I have another question for you, as you as a European yourself. why do European voters keep on putting such leaders in the leadership position? I mean, it seems like these guys don't even represent Europe's interests. I mean, they haven't done a very good job in the stewardship of the EU. But why are these guys keep on putting a position of leadership where they keep on leading Europe like down the cliff?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, you can only vote for people who are candidates. And when you look at the candidates that are available, it's basically, we have this expression in French, which is you need to choose between the plague and cholera, right? So it's like it's a bad choice versus a bad choice often. So you try to choose for the least bad one. And so in the last French election, it was a choice between Macron and Le Pen. That's not a great choice. Or you had a choice between yeah, it's a lot of there was this expression at some point by a Tanzanian president who said that the US is a one-party state, but in typical US exuberance, they have two of them. So it's often the same thing. Like you can choose between multiple parties, but the faces change and so on, but the policies will remain the same nonetheless. And one other point that's worth mentioning is that those elections, foreign affairs matters quite little. That's often the case in elections everywhere. You vote for people based on domestic concerns. And so that's what the elections are about most of the time, about insecurity or immigration or those type of stuff. Which means also that those leaders focus mostly on this and are quite uneducated about the rest of the world and how to behave with the external world and geopolitics and so on and so forth. Most French leaders to date didn't even speak English, for instance. Like they're really, really French. I think Macron is the first one, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, there is this. They're very used to Europe, this mindset. They've grown up in it. They've been educated in the European way of thinking and so on. And they're not well traveled. They don't understand how the rest of the world perceives them. They don't understand how the rest of the world thinks. This is extremely obvious when it comes to China. If you listen to what the average French politician says when it comes to China, it's absolutely obvious that they don't understand the first thing about the country. It's cliche after cliche, the same thing you hear from completely uneducated people. So yeah, that's just the quality. It's a quality and education issue.
Wow, I'm shocked at kind of similarity between Europe and United States because often we say U.S. is an extremely parochial country. People are not really interested in things happening outside the U.S. borders. So and people are not well traveled. Very few, only a small percentage Americans hold passport, and most of the people who did travel abroad went to Canada and Mexico, the immediate neighbors. I was surprised you described the same situation in Europe because at least in North America, it's thought that the Europeans are a lot more worldly and a lot more, well traveled and then more cosmopolitan than United States. At least you guys speak multiple languages, right? Not like the monolingual Americans.
I think in many cases it's actually even worse in Europe than it is in the US. I've lived in both countries. I think there is much more openness in the US than in Europe to point of views from other parts of the world. Probably because the US is a very multicultural country. And so that's in its DNA in some way to try to find common ground between different cultures. That's how it was built. Whereas that's not the case at all in Europe, right? We're very old cultures where if someone comes to Europe, they need to adapt to us. We don't adapt to them, right? So maybe it is the case, and it's probably true that more Europeans have passports, for instance, than Americans and so on. But the mindset, I think, is definitely more close-minded. You can just see it in the media. So there are some alternative medias in the US, actually quite a lot, like the Gray Zone or Drop Site, or those people who are just there is freedom of speech in that regard, and they understand the rest of the world and so on. In France, it's almost non-existent. I mean, there are maybe a couple, but as soon as you say something that slightly deviates from the Overton window, it's a massive scandal. So recently you had a French politician who said something. She said that China is not a dictatorship. She's a French MP. She said that in her view, China is not a dictatorship, which, even if you disagree with that, I happen to agree with it, but even if you disagree with that, why should it be shocking, right? Like, anyone can have their opinion, but that created a national scandal in France. Like, all the media started to speak about that, how scandalous it was, heretical to say that China was not a dictatorship, and so on. And she's basically the black sheep now. So that's kind of the mindset we have. I think, for a very, very long time. This is not new in Europe. We're a bit similar to the way we used to be during the Inquisition. You have this period of European history, the Inquisition, where anyone who slightly deviated from religious orthodoxy was a heretic, and they were burnt at the stake, and so on. This remains very strong in European culture. There is this orthodoxy when it comes to the thinking, the mainstream mindset, and it's much more heretical in Europe than it is in the US to slightly deviate from it. And the social consequences for you are very, very bad. Which is why, by the way, I actually tweet in English and not in French. I'm much more comfortable in French. That's my language. But I feel more free to express myself on my topics in English to an English audience than I will be to a French audience, because I know that what I'm saying will simply be, too scandalous for France.
Wow. I'm actually surprised by that because I always thought, because having lived in China and United States, I always thought US is way too ideological compared to China. Like, I feel like China moved into a post-ideological phase after the end of Cultural Revolution, but the US has gone in the opposite direction. Like, I feel like today's US is very, very much ideological. There's always that deep impulse to spread Americanism, as you all across the globe. It's the same evangelical impulse that existed before. There's the kind of the part of the American Protestant heritage, but now, instead of spreading gospel and Christianity, now United States try to spread the so-called universal value, but we all know it's not really universal. It's really just American values, and they try to impose that on everyone. So I'm surprised to hear that it's even worse in Europe, actually. quite shocked.
Yeah, I actually agree to a large extent with you, but I think that's slowly dying in the US. So I think Trump represents the end of that. Trump is anything but the liberal international value type. I think it's fair to say, right? Um, and I think the Americans are starting to understand that that actually did them a lot of harm to try to spread their model around the world and so on, because simply people don't want it, right? Like China doesn't want it, Russia doesn't want it, all the big countries, Africa doesn't want it. They want to keep their culture, which is normal. That's just you don't want to be converted to something that doesn't feel natural. And so in a way, a big part of the reason behind the emergence of the multipolar world is this reaction to the imposition by the US of this framework. Like everyone would have been, I think, happy to live in a world where the US is a major power, but a power that doesn't try to impose things that you don't want, right? That would have been a comfortable world for everyone. Like China would have been happy with that. Like, just let me live my life, right? But they didn't choose to do that, and as such, there is this kind of rebellion, which leads to a multipolar world. And so I think the US is starting to understand that, and Trump is not pushing for that at all. He's all about pure cynicism and doesn't care about values and so on, which has its own issues, but it's a different thing. Whereas Europe, they very much stayed in that. They still view the world in a very missionary way, where they're like, we have the best values, and any we have we only engage positively with like-minded partners. I mean, all the rhetoric that we used to hear from the US, they're still very present in Europe. So they haven't moved on at all. And so far, I don't see many politicians in Europe who are moving on, that they are still in that mindset.
What's the European political class plan? Are they just trying to wait out Trump, trying to hopefully for like a return to a pre-Trump America, for like somebody more like Biden or Obama, who talk about transatlantic partnership and like alliance of democracy and all that good stuff, or they're just trying to, I don't know, survive survive the Trump era? What are your takes?
I think it's very hard to discern a coherent strategy from Europe, to be honest. Especially because when you're talking about Europe, what are you even talking about? There is this famous quote from Kissinger, which is, Europe, like, who do I call? Right? Who do you call? Do you call von der Leyen? But half the European leaders hate her, and anyway, as per Europe's own treaties, she has no say in foreign affairs when it comes to that's no one will say she represents Europe. Do you call Macron? He's on one line. Do you call Merz? He's on a slightly different line, actually much more US friendly than Macron. So I think that is very much part of the prime, as per the way Europe is. It's very, very difficult to have a coherent strategy emerge, because there is no figure or no structure to make it arise. It's all conflicts, and so you end up arriving at the lowest common denominator, sort of like it's it's basically some sort of compromise that Europe strategy is some sort of compromise that everyone dislikes, but that is that they can sort of live with, which at the end of the day ends up being more of the same, right? No change, because everyone is on a different line. So that's very much the core of the issue, I would say.
As a European person who have spent significant time in China, and quite familiar, I would say you're quite familiar with Chinese culture, and politics. How do you think EU and China relationship should develop? I mean, like, what is your ideal European Chinese relationship should look like?
I mean, what I've always said is that first of all, the most important first step is mutual understanding. And I think China understands Europe fairly well. China spends an enormous amount of time educating itself on the world, and they have, when you meet a Chinese diplomat, you always, like, as per their education system, for diplomats, they speak the local language of the country where they're posted. They've studied the culture. So, the Chinese ambassador in France expresses himself in French. He studied French culture. So he gets the culture, but there is no equivalent in Europe, right? There are remarkably little Europeans, even in the diplomatic world, who understand China, who speak Chinese. I don't think, like, I met the French ambassador to China, for instance. He doesn't speak Chinese. So yeah, that's the first step. If you want to deal with China, you first need to understand that, because otherwise you base your action on an illusion of what China is instead of the real China. And I think this is one of the important moves that we're going to see as a multipolar world arises. I've actually studied quite a bit what the multipolar world used to look like when we used to have one in like the 16th, 17th century. Back in those days, China was very powerful, as it has always been almost in history. It's only after the Industrial Revolution that you had the century of humiliation. China was very weak and so on, and then you had the West emerge as really dominant in the world. That wasn't the case before in history. And so before, when China was very strong, you had I read a lot of books of Jesuit missionaries, for instance, who went to China. What I'm struck with when I read them is that there is none of that ideology that you have today, where they qualify China in very judgmental ways and so on. There is a genuine attempt to understand them. And why? Because China was so powerful. So when someone is powerful, you cannot submit them. You cannot say, you need to do what I say. You can only convince them of something. And so to convince someone, you need to understand where they come from, right? If you can't dictate what they should do, you need to convince them, and in order to convince them, you need to understand them. And I think this is a key requirement in a multipolar world. China is now too powerful to dictate anything to them, and so you need to convince them. And in order to convince them, you need to understand them. So my consistent advice to Europe is invest an enormous amount of resources in understanding China, so you can have a relationship where, if you need to push your interest, you can convince the Chinese. So that's the first step, but it's we're far from it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Why is there such an incuriosity? Given that today EU and China has such an important trade relationship. Given the enormity of the trade volumes that flows from China to Europe and vice versa, why is then there's not as many people interested in finding out what is going on in the opposite end of the Eurasia, the world's most important economy? Like, I mean, I should ask the same question to United States, but I think we all know the answer, because U.S. Americans are usually too self-absorbed in their own country and their own problems. But my question is for you as a Europeans, why do you think there is that similar? I mean, I understand why Chinese would have learned more about Europe or United States, because, as you said, because of power imbalance, because the European power came to China's shores. So ever since, China has tried to learn what made Europe leapfrog China, and they try to make sure China does not fall behind again. So why is there such an incuriosity about China when China is becoming ever more important, and there's Europe's one of the largest trading partners?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's the legacy of arrogance. In fact, China used to be the same in many ways, and that was one of the reasons of its downfall, arguably during the Qing dynasty, where there was that level of arrogance where they knew they were very powerful, and so they didn't need to know the rest of the world. And lo and behold, you had actually the West that had become also very powerful, and because China didn't understand them, then they got beaten. And that's why China right now is very keen not to make this mistake again, and they invest so much in understanding others and understanding the world in which we live in. Well, I think it's much the same dynamic in the West, in Europe. They've been dominant in the world. I'm speaking of the West in general ever since the Industrial Revolution, so for like 250 years or so. And so there is that legacy of, we have no need to understand others because we're so used to submit them. So in my own education in France, I was not taught at all the history of the rest of the world. Like, I knew nothing about China. Literally nothing. I don't think I was ever taught about any part of Chinese history in my education. I knew nothing about Africa and so on. It's purely Europe-centric. It's like we hold the truth, and all the rest of the world is will eventually, either they've adopted our model, in which case is good, either they haven't, in which case they're mistaken, and they eventually will. That's kind of the mindset. So it's a whole mindset to change, and that takes a very, very long time. I mean, in China's case, it took 1 century, the century of humiliation, right?
Arnaud, are you saying that the West need its own century of humiliation before they learn the lessons? I'm joking.
I mean, I'm saying I think, unfortunately, it's part of cycles, right, in history, where you sort of you have this saying like strong men create good times create weak men create hard times, and so on and so forth. So we're in the weak men era. and we need to have hard times in order to eat our humble pie and sort of understand how to create good times again.
Wow, this fascinating conversation. I can geek out on this with you for hours. Is there anything else you'd like to talk to my audience about, whether on Europe or China?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe something I was writing just before this call. I think it's quite interesting to see the way US-China relations are evolving. So you had a call between Trump and Xi yesterday China time. Maybe it's still today US time. I don't know. Where basically she in the transcript, in the Chinese transcript, is reframing the China-US relation as World War II partners. Like, we are partners. We need to uphold, the World War II consensus. Like, we were the victors of World War II, and we need to, keep that partnership going. So there is on both sides, on both the Chinese side and the American side, there is a reframing of the relationship. On the American side, you have the G2 framing by Trump. So I find this very, very interesting. And I think it's also a missed opportunity again for Europe, because and also when it comes to Russia, by the way, like, Trump is starting to improve relations with Russia, which is probably great for American interests, good for Russian interests as well. The relationship with China is being reframed as well. You have more positive language from both sides, from the Chinese side and the American side, and the Europeans again are left like behind. Like, why would which is kind of crazy, because it was mostly about China US, right? That's where the main antagonism was, and so it was a good opportunity for Europe to sort of get ahead of that and say, okay, we are China's friends, and so the Americans are kind of left on their own, right? And you have the whole of Eurasia sort of being friend. That could have been a good thing from a European interest standpoint, but because they didn't jump on this opportunity, Trump is doing that before Europeans, and Europeans are sort of left as this appendage to Eurasia that no one likes. Like, Trump doesn't like them anymore. Russia doesn't like them. China are like, yeah, like, you're weirdly antagonistic to us. We don't get it. Like, why? So yeah, I find this just it's a shame, basically, from a Europe standpoint.
The Japanese actually had a term for it. When Nixon first visited China back in the 70s, they call it the Nixon shock, because the Japanese leadership were left completely in the dark when Nixon and Kissinger reframed the Sino-American relationship. So they launched their own diplomatic offensive to improve their ties with China after that. But I don't know. I don't expect too much from the European leadership at this point. We'll have to wait and see. But this is an absolutely fascinating conversation I'm having with you, and I look forward to have you on my show again, because this is a recurring thing on whether Europe can one day achieve strategic autonomy and be one of the pole of the multipolar world. Everybody, including China, is looking to Europe to take a stronger stand, but so far there's a lot of disappointment. But this is a developing story. Yeah. We all are keeping our eyes on it, and Europe is still, despite all its problems and despite that it's currently being cannibalized by United States for its own goods, it still remains a very important part of the world and a very important part of the world economy. This is why others have expect European leaders to finally grow a spine, but we'll have to see whether that happens or not. So for people who want to reach you or want to follow you on social media, where would they go, Arnaud?
So on Twitter, I'm Arnaud Bertrand. So you can probably see my name, and on Substack, where I'm under my name as well.
Okay, so do you have more thought? Do you feel like your content is getting more readership on Twitter or Substack nowadays?
Well, definitely Twitter. I have on average about 100 million views a month on Twitter, which is quite a lot. Whereas on Substack, it's I don't know, not even 1 million or something.
I mean, 1 million is a large number. I mean, congratulations, and you well deserve it, because you actually take the time to write out these long form Twitter posts, which I really appreciate, because you took your time and to put these in simple language that everybody could understand, and a very important topic as well. Usually you write on the.
Thank you so much, and it's in a way all your legacy, because I think you were the first one to actually take a stance on Twitter and all of that to be more to try to push a better understanding of China. So you're the original product, and we're all Carl Zha followers in a way.
I'm just a shit poster online. I have to make that disclaimer. I most of the time shit posting on Twitter is just fun for me. But you reading your post is actually educational. So I urge everybody to check out Arnaud Bertrand on Twitter, and go check out his Substack. He's this is where he explore his thoughts in depth on the issue of Europe, China, and U.S. relationship, in our fast changing world. Again, thank you, Arnaud, for making your time to speak to us. I look forward to have this conversation with you again in the future.
Thank you. Me too.